All right, let's dive into Langfuse, this open source platform that's really making some noise in the LLM development world. You ever get that feeling like you're building with LLMs, kind of like navigating a maze but blindfolded?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Langfuse is like someone handed you a flashlight and a map?
It really
Oh.
is, you know? Debugging traditional software, it's tough enough, right? But LLMs, they add this whole other level of complexity. I mean, their unpredictable nature and just the mountains of data they work with. It's not just about, squashing bugs. It's about really understanding how your LLM application is working, like every step of the way.
That's where this whole tracing thing comes in, right?
Hmm.
From what I've seen in the documentation, Langfuse, it captures like a ton of information about what's happening inside your application. What kind of stuff are we actually talking about?
Mhm.
Yeah, you're spot on. So the core of Langfuse is this nested tracing system. Imagine you have a complex LLM app, maybe an agent that's interacting with a bunch of APIs to complete a task. Langfuse, it breaks down that entire execution flow into these nested traces. It's like a super detailed timeline. Every single API call, every prompt, the context that's being passed around, any parallel processes happening, it's
Yeah.
all captured.
So instead of just seeing the inputs and outputs of my LLM, I can actually peek into like its thought process at each step. That's pretty wild. But how does Langfuse actually do that? Does it need me to like instrument my code in a certain way?
Ah, that's a great question. And the answer is, it's pretty straightforward, actually. Langfuse has SDKs for different languages like Python, JavaScript, and they're adding more. You basically wrap your LLM interactions with Langfuse functions. So instead of calling your LLM directly,
Yeah.
you'd use something like langfuse.trace.track with your inputs and outputs from the SDK.
So I don't need to rewrite my whole app. It's more like adding these Langfuse calls around the parts I want to keep an eye on. Exactly. And the cool thing is, those inputs and outputs, those dictionaries, they can hold anything that's relevant. The actual text of the prompt, the model's response, API parameters, anything you need. Langfuse stores all of this in a structured format so you can search it and analyze it later.
I can see how that would be like a lifesaver when you're debugging. If something goes wrong, you've got this trail of breadcrumbs leading you right to the problem. But what happens to all this data? Where does it all go?
Another great question. So Langfuse is built with flexibility in mind. By default, it uses a Scala database, which is great for getting started or for smaller projects. But for bigger applications or production environments, you can easily set it up to use PostgreSQL. It's a really robust database.
So I'm not stuck with one specific database. That's always good, especially for integrating with other systems. But with all this tracing and data storage, doesn't that add a lot of overhead to the application? LLMs can already be pretty resource intensive.
Yeah, it's a valid concern for sure. But the Langfuse team, they've put a lot of effort into keeping the overhead low. The tracing is asynchronous, so it won't block your app's main execution. And the data storage is optimized for efficiency. You won't end up with like gigabytes of logs unless your app is just massive.
Okay, that makes sense. Asynchronous operations are key when you're dealing with, potentially long LLM calls. So I see how this tracing is really helpful for understanding what's happening inside the application. But what about the bigger picture? Can I use LangFuse to, say, track how my LLM app is performing over time?
Absolutely, yeah. Remember how we talked about nested traces? Well, Langfuse groups those traces into what are called sessions. Think of a session as like a container for all the interactions related to a task or a specific user flow. Like if you're building a chatbot, each conversation with the chatbot would be a session.
So I could analyze how the chatbot performs over a whole conversation, not just individual turns.
Exactly. And Langfuse gives you tools to visualize and analyze all that session data, like cost per session, average latency, success rates, things like that. It's powerful for tracking your app's overall health and finding areas for improvement.
That's starting to sound really useful, like for performance monitoring and optimization. But before we go any deeper, I think it would be good to get a clearer picture of how all this data actually looks to a developer.
You're right, that's where the Langfuse dashboard comes in. It gives you a visual representation of all this data, so it's easy to see what's going on. You can see things like how your costs are distributed, average response times, and even drill down into individual traces to get all the details of each step. We can look at the dashboard more later on.
Sounds good. I'm definitely interested to see that. So
Sure.
we've covered tracing, sessions, data storage, and even got a glimpse of the dashboard. But I know LangFuse goes beyond these core features, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's got a whole suite of tools covering different stages of the LLM development lifecycle, from managing your prompts to evaluating the model's performance. But before we get into all that, do you have any questions about the tracing or session management stuff we've talked about so far?
That's a good idea. Let's take a moment to process all of this, especially for anyone who's hearing about Langfuse for the first time. So if you're listening and have a question about how Langfuse captures all this detailed information, how it's stored, or how sessions are used to track performance, now's the time to ask. We'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, it's always great to answer questions and clarify anything about Langfuse. It's a pretty powerful tool. And the more you know how it works, the better you can use it to really build something cool.
Totally agree. Getting into the nitty-gritty, that's what this is all about. Now, before we took a break for questions, we're just starting to talk about some of Langfuse's other features, like prompt management. And this is something that comes up all the time in LLM development.
Right.
You spend hours crafting the perfect prompt, and then you realize, oh, I need to tweak it a bit, or maybe try something totally different. It can get messy fast.
They really can, yeah. And that's exactly why Langfuse has this prompt management system. Think of it like version control, but for your prompts, with some added bonuses.
Version control for prompts. Okay, that's interesting. Anything that brings some order to prompt engineering is welcome. But how does that actually work?
So let's say you have a prompt. You're using it to generate product descriptions, right? You've got it hard-coded into your app. It's working okay. But you have a feeling that maybe adding more context or rephrasing something can make it even better.
Yeah, I think everyone's been there. You never really know if a prompt is as good as it can be until
Yeah.
you've experimented a bit.
Exactly. So with Langfuse's prompt management, you can create a bunch of versions of that prompt and store them all in one place. Each version gets its own ID, so you can keep track of everything. But here's where it gets really cool. You don't have to change your app code every time you want to try a new prompt. Langfuse lets you fetch the prompts dynamically while your app is running.
Hold on. So I could have a setting in my app that tells it which prompt version to use, and I can switch between versions without redeploying the whole thing.
Yep, exactly. Langfuse gives you SDKs and APIs to make that dynamic fetching really smooth. You would just say, hey, Langfuse, give me version 3 of this prompt. And it delivers it straight to your app, right then and there.
So it's not just about storing and organizing them, it's about integrating them into your workflow so you can experiment quickly. That's a game changer for finding those little improvements that can make a big difference.
It really is. And it gets even better when you use prompt management with Langfuse's tracing. Remember how we talked about capturing all the inputs and outputs for each call to the LLM? Well, that includes which version of the prompt was used.
Ah, I see what you mean. So I can test out different prompt versions easily. But I can also see how each version affects things like the quality of the response, the time it takes to generate it, even the cost, all in the Langfuse dashboard.
Precisely. It's like having a detailed report for each prompt version, so you can make informed decisions about which ones work best for you.
Okay, now I'm seeing how these different features really start to work together to create a much better, more streamlined development process. But when we talk about prompt versions, what does that actually look like behind the scenes? Is it just storing different text strings in a database? Or is there more to it?
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of how Langfuse is built for developers. Underneath it all, prompts are treated like first-class objects. They have their own data structure and metadata.
So it's not just a simple string. What kind of metadata are we talking about?
Well, each prompt version can have a description, tags to categorize it, a creation timestamp, and you can even add your own custom metadata, like key value pairs. This way, you can add any information that's important to you, like the purpose of the prompt, who it's for, even who created it.
Wow, that's really organized. It's like taking the principles of software engineering and applying them to prompt management, something that's often just an afterthought.
Exactly. And having that structure makes it so much easier to analyze your prompts later on. You can search for them by their tags, filter by creation date, even write custom queries to find exactly what you need. It brings a whole new level of efficiency to prompt management.
This is great. But how much control do I have over where these prompts are stored? We talked about Langfuse supporting different databases for tracing data. Does that apply to prompts as well?
You're thinking like a true engineer. And the answer is yes, you have that flexibility. By default, the prompt data is stored in the same database as your tracing data, which could be SQLite or PostgreSQL. But you can configure Langfuse to use a separate database just for prompts, or even integrate with a different prompt management system if you already use one.
That's really helpful, especially for teams that are already using certain tools. It sounds like Langfuse is designed to fit in with what you're already doing.
Exactly. The goal is to give developers more power, not to limit them. And speaking of empowerment, let's talk about another feature that works really well with prompt management: evaluations. This is where you can really see how your prompts and LLMs are doing, not just in terms of the output they produce, but in terms of actually meeting your goals and criteria.
Evaluations, that's a whole other topic we could deep dive into. But I'm curious to hear how Langfuse approaches this.
Well, one of the main ideas behind Langfuse evaluations is that there's no single way to measure the quality of LLM output. Different applications have different needs, and what's considered good in one context might not be good in another.
That makes sense. A chatbot for casual conversation is going to be evaluated differently than, say, an LLM that's generating medical diagnoses. So how does Langfuse handle this need for flexibility?
It uses a multifaceted approach. You can combine different evaluation methods to get a complete picture of how your LLM is performing. You can use human feedback, which is great for subjective things, like creativity, humor, or the overall quality of writing. You can also use LLM as a judge, where you basically use another LLM to score the outputs of your main LLM based on criteria you define. And for more technical applications, you can set up custom metrics and evaluation pipelines that are specific to your domain.
Wow, that's a lot of options. It seems like Langfuse is really giving developers the tools they need to evaluate their LLMs in a way that makes sense for their specific situation.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond simple metrics like accuracy and looking at LLM evaluation in a more nuanced and comprehensive way.
This is all really interesting, and I'm sure everyone listening is learning a ton about how Langfuse handles prompts and evaluation. But before we move on to other features, let's take a moment for questions. Do you have any questions about how Langfuse does prompt versioning, or the metadata, dynamic fetching, or its flexible evaluation framework? Now's your chance to ask. Wow, this deep dive has been, well, deep. We've covered so much ground. From how Langfuse traces everything, to the more complex ideas of prompt management and evaluation. But there are a couple more features I'd love to explore before we wrap things up.
Yeah, we still got plenty to talk about. Langfuse has a lot of tools for different stages of LLM development. What are you thinking about next?
Well, the datasets feature caught my attention. We've mentioned how datasets are super important for evaluating LLMs. But I'm curious, how does Langfuse actually help developers manage these datasets?
It's a really key part of the workflow. Langfuse datasets is all about keeping things organized and accessible. You can create datasets that are specific to certain tasks or areas, and basically these datasets are just collections of inputs and outputs. They represent the kinds of interactions you expect your LLM to handle.
So if I'm making a chatbot for customer support, I could have a dataset with common customer questions and the best answers for each one.
Exactly. And then you can use that dataset to test how well your chatbot is doing. It's a structured way to measure your LLM's performance and track its progress over time.
That makes sense. But how does Langfuse store these datasets? Is it the same database as the tracing data and prompts, or is it something separate?
Another great question. Langfuse is all about flexibility, remember. You can store datasets in the same database as everything else, but you can also set up a dedicated database just for datasets if that works better for you.
So whether I'm using a small local squad database or a huge PostgreSQL instance, Langfuse can handle it. That's pretty impressive. But it's not just about storing the datasets, right? It's about being able to actually use them.
You got it. Langfuse has tools to easily load, query, and analyze your datasets. You can use the Langfuse APIs to grab specific data points, filter datasets based on certain criteria, even split them into training, validation, and testing sets for machine learning.
That's a data scientist's dream come true. Having all these features built right into an LLM development platform is so valuable. It makes the whole process of collecting, organizing, and analyzing data so much easier.
It does. And there's one more feature I think our listeners will appreciate. The LLM playground.
Ah, yes, the playground. I've heard it's like a sandbox where developers can experiment with LLMs and prompts without having to write a bunch of code. Is that right?
That's the idea. The LLM playground is all about quick prototyping and testing things out. You can try different prompts, adjust model parameters, even use different LLMs from various providers, all within a really easy-to-use interface.
So it's like a virtual lab where I can play around with LLMs and see how they respond to different things without setting up a whole complex development environment.
Exactly. It's great for getting a feel for how different LLMs work, trying out prompt engineering techniques, and really understanding what these models can and can't do.
That's super helpful,
Yeah.
especially for people who are new to LLMs or anyone who wants to experiment without diving into a big coding project.
For sure. The LLM playground makes it much easier for developers to get into LLM development.
Well, we've explored a ton about Langfuse in this deep dive. We've looked at its tracing features, learned about prompt management and evaluation, and even touched on how it handles data sets and the LLM playground. It's clear that Langfuse is a powerful and comprehensive platform that's really changing how we build and use LLMs.
I agree. It's a move towards a more structured, transparent, and ultimately more effective way of developing LLMs. It gives developers the tools and information they need to build AI applications that are robust, reliable, and really impressive.
It's been fantastic discussing Langfuse with you today. To everyone listening, if you want to learn more, definitely check out the Langfuse website, their documentation, and even their GitHub repo. There's a whole community of developers out there who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible with LLMs, and Langfuse is right at the forefront of all of that.
And remember, things are changing so fast in the LLM world. But with tools like Langfuse, developers can navigate this exciting landscape, knowing they have the resources and support they need to build amazing AI-powered solutions.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Langfuse. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building incredible things with AI.